Some houses don't wait to become haunted. Some are born that way. They say every home remembers the ones who were supposed to live inside it, even the ones who never made it through the door. But sometimes it's the empty room that echoes the loudest. Sometimes something answers back. If you listen long enough, you'll hear the footsteps that were never taken, feel the breath that was never breathed, and in the dark, you'll swear you hear a heartbeat that shouldn't exist. The moving truck was a dust-covered behemoth, a final, weary sentinel guarding the promise of their new beginning. Jonas stood on the cracked asphalt drive of their new home, breathing in the scent of aged pine and damped earth. "Isn't it perfect, Jonas? So much light." Lydia's voice was sunshine, a bright, melodic counterpoint to the house's silent, shadowed gravitas. Her optimism was a shield, forged a blueprint and future plans. She looped her arm through his, pulling him towards the front door as if their collective would instantly erase years of dust and neglect. "It has good bones, Lyd," he'd managed, a smile that felt stiff lifting from the corners of his mouth. He was quiet, always. He had been the quiet one since they had first seen the house 3 months ago. A strange, deep-seated silence he kept locked behind the facade of the strong, supportive husband. He often pressed the palm of his hand flat against his stomach, a protective, grounding gesture he developed over the last year. The house was a blank slate, but as they toured through the echoing, empty rooms, they found a single exception on the second floor. It was in the room at the end of the hall, the smallest of the 3 bedrooms, the one they had already mentally marked as the nursery. It was empty, save for the one solitary, incongruous object, an antique wooden cradle. It was heavy oak, dark with age, its finish long gone, leaving the wood splintered and rough. It looked less like furniture and more like a salvaged coffin, ancient and out of place against the creamy, untouched walls. Jonas walked toward it, his steps suddenly heavy. The air around the cradle was cold, a sudden drop in temperature that pricked his skin. He didn't touch it, but he stared into the emptiness of the hollow basin. An invisible, sickening hook snagged his insides, pulling a suffocating weight up from his stomach to his throat. Grief. Raw, unspoken, and vast. It was the only word he had for the feeling, but he didn't know why it applied to this piece of wood. "Oh, look at that old thing," Lydia chirped, her tone light, oblivious to the pall that had settled over him. "It must have been left by the previous owners or something. Maybe they forgot it." She gave it a cheerful little tap, which caused a dry, rustling sound that made Jonas flinch. "We can just burn it," Lydia said, the words coming out of her mouth flat and too loud. Jonas turned, startled by her intensity. "Burn it? No, it's just old. Maybe we can keep it. It kind of looks nice in the room." "Keep it?" Lydia questioned her husband. "Absolutely not. We can toss it down to the curb for the trash or maybe donate it, but we definitely don't need it. We'll get a nice modern one whenever we do decide to have a baby." Jonas swallowed, forcing the tension from his shoulders. "Right. Of course. Just get rid of it. I'll get it taken care of soon." "Sounds good, my love," she said, planting a quick, sweet kiss on his cheek before moving to inspect the peeling wallpaper. "I'm thinking of sky blue in here. That way it'll be easy to change if we have a boy." Jonas nodded, already walking out of the room. He needed distance. He felt Lydia's gaze on his back, but she said nothing. He had promised to get rid of it, but he never did. The cradle remained, a silent, splintered monument at the end of the hall. The first 2 weeks were a blur of unpacking and housewarming cheer. Lydia was in her element. Her parents, her sister, and various cousins rotated through daily, bringing casseroles and advice. "Oh, Lydia, you look so positively radiant," her mother would exclaim, holding her hand. "How's the house? How are you holding up? You don't let that man work you too hard." They asked Lydia about everything. The paint, the furniture, the future. They rarely looked at Jonas. And when they did, it was usually to say, "Jonas, you're the rock, aren't you? Keep that girl smiling." Jonas would always smile back. The rock. He felt more like an empty vessel, a hollow statue standing in the living room while life swirled around him. The weight in his gut grew daily, a leaden counterweight to Lydia's relentless joy. He kept the door to the nursery room closed. Lydia noticed his avoidance. "Still haven't taken out that old crib, have you?" she asked one evening, folding laundry. He didn't look up from the stack of boxes he was dismantling. He instinctively pressed his hand to his stomach. "Too busy, Lyd. I'll get it soon." "Okay, honey, but you just seem a little on edge lately. You haven't been sleeping well. Just stress, right? New house, big changes?" Her voice was full of concern, but the concern was already packaged and dismissed. She couldn't see the silent, agonizing future he kept reliving. "Just stress," he echoed, his own unspoken fear and the paralyzing, suffocating loneliness of his silent sorrow shoved back down, sealed beneath the polished floorboards of his quiet smile. He knew he was unseen, but he preferred it that way. He always had trouble explaining what was going on inside himself, partially because he didn't know what was going on either. He wouldn't allow himself to take away from others' moments. He wouldn't push his burden onto his wife, who was happy with their new house and plans for the future. He didn't know how to explain the hollow space inside him, the fear he felt when looking at the empty cradle, or the reason why he couldn't bring himself to remove it. That night, Jonas woke in an absolute lightless dark, instantly alert. A sound had filtered down the hall, a soft, ethereal chime, like glass striking glass, high and delicate, jingling. It was the sound of something familiar, a baby mobile. A delicate carousel turning gently on its wire, a soft lullaby which was supposed to bring peace, brought urgency in Jonas. He sat up, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was impossible. The house was empty. Lydia was asleep beside him, breathing deeply, undisturbed. He slipped out of bed, moving soundlessly across the polished wood floor. As he approached the nursery door, the gentle, high-pitched music was distant, but the music played on instruments that weren't there. He reached for the doorknob. The jingling intensified. Then a new sound joined in. A delicate, innocent, utterly heartbreaking sound of life beginning. The sound of a tiny presence, newly born, content in the darkness. He pushed the door open, ready to confront the noise. The room was bathed in a pale wash of the street lamps outside. The air was still. The cradle, dark and forbidding, was rocking, gently, slowly, back and forth. And then, the cooing stopped. The jingling ceased. Only the rhythmic, dry creak of the empty cradle remained. Jonas stood there for a full minute, rigid, listening to the silence. He tried to tell himself it was the house settling, the wind, a dream. But the cradle continued to rock for another 3 seconds, then stopped, absolutely still. "Hello?" he whispered into the dark. Only the thundering silence of the old house answered him. He closed the door, his hands trembling. He didn't get rid of the cradle. He didn't even touch it. He went back to bed and lay awake until dawn. watching the shadows crawl around the ceiling. The next night, Jonas fell asleep near 3 a.m., only to be yanked back to consciousness by a new sound, closer this time, just outside their bedroom door. He could hear it on the carpet runner in the hall. Too low for a footstep, too rhythmic for a settling house. Jonas sat up, chilled to the bone. A crawl. A small body moving across the floor. He listened, paralyzed. The sound moved from their door to down the hall towards the nursery. Tiny, open palms hitting the floor. He reached for the lamp. Before his fingers touched the switch, something invisible brushed past his ankle. A slight displacement of air, an icy, feathery stroke that made him gasp and pull his legs up onto the bed. He scrambled to run to the light switch to turn on the light in the hallway. The light flooded the space, harsh and yellow. The hallway was empty. He peered out the door. The air was unnaturally cold. He looked down. The old pattern rug in the hall was lightly dusted with a film of construction dust and plaster. Now, running down the entire length of the hall were distinct, parallel streaks in the dust. Wide, low streaks made by something dragging itself, interspersed with the half-moon impressions of tiny hands. Jonas stared, his mouth dry. No. He had to be imagining things. The dust had settled. Wrong. He heard the dry, empty creak from the nursery at the end of the hall. A single, distinct creak of a cradle that had not been touched. He heard the quiet, almost inaudible sounds inside the nursery. A soft, choked cough. Not a human cough, but a dry, rattling sound from something small, struggling to clear its throat. Jonas went to the nursery and slammed the door shut. He leaned his weight against it. He didn't care what Lydia thought anymore. He just wanted the door to stay shut. The next day, Lydia's family arrived for the housewarming party. The house was loud, smelling of red wine and charcuterie boards. Jonas stood near the kitchen, a ghost in the crowd, plastered with a rock smile. "Jonas, you look awful," Lydia's brother Frankie whispered to him, pulling him aside. "Thanks, Frank. Long hours at work," he lied smoothly. "No, I mean, really awful. Like you haven't slept in a week or something. And you're so jumpy. I saw you flinch when Mom dropped a glass. Look, is everything okay?" You also seem distant from Lydia. Jonas forced a hearty, utterly false laugh. "Well, it's just these things started happening every night. I don't even know how to explain it." "You're still going on about that dream, Jonas?" Lydia cuts him off. She walked over and put a hand on his arm, but the gesture felt like a correction, not a comfort. Jonas could not blame his wife for not believing him when it came to these nightly events. She never saw any of it, and when he had told her about the events, there was no evidence of anything out of the ordinary happening in their house. The dust marks, the crib rocking, everything that Jonas told Lydia came with a possible reasoning. Jonas had seen it, though, but he knew how ridiculous it had sounded. "You're right, Lydia," Jonas agreed and stopped with the story. He rubbed the palm of his hand against his stomach again. "It's just nightmares. They're vivid, but nothing to be pressed about." "Okay," Frankie said, his eyes skeptical. "Well, nightmares can be very vivid, especially in new houses. You're still getting used to the new place." "That's why I keep telling them," Lydia speaks up, her brow furrowed with genuine worry, through her voice that remained steady. "Just give it a week or so, and you'll be back to sleeping through the night like a baby." He nodded, grateful for the empty gesture, knowing he could never tell them what was happening. He couldn't explain that this wasn't a dream. This was really happening. But no one would believe him for a second. He looked up the stairs, his eyes drawn to the closed door of the nursery. The house was full of life, laughter, and chatter, But Jonas knew at the end of the hall, a small, dark silence was waiting for the music to stop. Jonas was dreaming of being trapped in a dense, suffocating fog when the sound woke him. It was in the room now, close. A sudden, violent thump against the drywall, followed by a dry, frantic scraping sound from down the hall. He heard the cradle begin to rock, but not gently this time, but thrashing against the floorboards, hitting the walls. Jonas would not wait to see what was going on. He hopped out of bed and ran down the hall, but something stopped him dead in his tracks. A sound that drove the air from his lungs. A breathy, strained whisper, high-pitched and ragged. Jonas' eyes widened. He was caught in a paralyzing chill, unable to move another step or turn his head towards the noise. He relaxed for a second, afraid to move a muscle. He closes his eyes and gains the strength before slowly moving his head towards where the noise came from. But there was nothing there. Nothing other than the darkness of night casting its shadow into the cold house. Jonas relaxes his tension and breathes a sigh of relief. But it's just when he gets too comfortable, the entity speaks. It wasn't in his head. It was coming from right next to where he was standing. Jonas could hear his heart beating in his ears. No, no, no. He scrambled. He ran back down the hall towards his bedroom and bust through the doors. He had to stop this. "Lyd, wake up," he hissed. Lydia mumbled, shifting in the bed. "It's here. I hear it. Something is in the house." The sound was now a chorus, a rapid-fire, frantic repetition coming from multiple points in the room. No, in the entire house. One from the corner, one from the center of the ceiling, one from right outside the door. Many distinct, tiny, breathless voices chanting something at him. The voices were distorted, each one crying a faint, high-pitched echo, like a recording played on a broken tape. Jonas staggered back into the hallway, his knees weak. The air was now thick, heavy with the stench of decaying wood and something sickly sweet, like spoiled milk. The voices multiplied again. 4, 5, 6 tiny voices surrounding him, buzzing in his ears, a chaotic swarm of sounds. He clapped his hands over his ears, dropping to his knees. The floors were vibrating. "Stop it!" he screamed, tears stinging his eyes. Lydia was finally awake. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands pressed over her mouth. "Jonas, what is it? What are you doing?" She flicked on the hall light. The instant the light cut through the dark, the sound vanished. Silence, absolute and profound. Lydia looked at the hallway, then at Jonas, huddled on the floor, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Jonas, what on earth is wrong with you?" she asked, her voice tight, genuinely laced with fear for him. "I didn't hear anything. You were just yelling." "The voices, Lyd. The voices. They were everywhere, calling something. The cradle was thrashing." He looked at her, desperate for validation. She walked past him, opened the nursery door, and looked inside. She flicked the light on. The room was perfectly calm, empty, the dark cradle standing motionless against the far wall. "There's nothing here, honey. Nothing. You're scaring me. You need to talk to someone. You haven't slept in days. You're imagining things." She knelt and took his hand, her touch cool and concerned. "Jonas, I know you're stressed, but this isn't stress. I'm worried about you." He sat there, defeated. His fear, his sorrow, his horror. It was all now packaged and labeled as Jonas's delusions. He couldn't sleep, couldn't even close his eyes. He sat in his armchair in the living room, listening to the house breathe. Around 2 a.m., a muffled sound came from the nursery. Not a whisper or a crash, but a cheerful, melodic sound. Laughter, innocent, pure. A child's bright giggle echoing from the end of the hall. Jonas got up, drawn by the sound of genuine, unhorrifying joy. He crept to the door and eased it open. The room was different. The bare walls faintly marked just above the height of a small child with streaky, vibrant crayon in red and blues. Near the wall, a single, smooth wooden block, a primary red cube, sat nestled against the floorboards. The thin, white curtain hanging at the window had a faint pattern superimposed on them, small, yellow rubber ducks. The room had grown. It was no longer the empty, terrifying nursery, but a child's bedroom. Slightly messy, lived in, and full of color only he could see. The laughter was louder now, playful and ringing, centered around the cradle. Then, the laughter broke. It stopped with a sickening, wet, choking gasp. The pure sound of joy fractured into a ragged, desperate sound. A small child struggling to catch its breath, drowning in air. Jonas lunged forward, his heart hammering in his throat. He didn't know why he felt this way, but he needed to save it. He had to help it, help the source of the choking. As he crossed the threshold in the room, the colorful marks vanished. The block disintegrated. The curtains became plain white again. The choking had stopped. He stood in the cold, empty, terrified room. The only sound was the familiar dry, hollow creak of the cradle, slowly, endlessly rocking. He felt the horror set in, deep and absolute. Something wasn't trying to scare him, wasn't trying to take his life, but his thoughts, his everything. It was aging. How long did Jonas have until it was too late? He was spiraling down a path he didn't know how it would end. But he needed to make it stop before it stopped him. Jonas didn't leave consciousness. He didn't want to enter the space of shared darkness. He didn't know if he would be able to win that night's battle, and in turn lose the war that he had been fighting since moving into this new house. But the horror found him anyway. He fell into a shadow, fitful sleep, and was instantly plunged into a terrifying lucid dream. He was standing in the dark hallway, but the sounds were heavy now, loud, deliberate. Footsteps paced back and forth in the nursery. Heavy, angry sighs, full of boundless, frustrated energy. The dream shifted. Jonas gasped, pulling himself awake in the armchair, his heart slamming against his ribs. But the scene was already in front of him. He was in the nursery, or what used to be the nursery. It was unrecognizable. The walls were covered in dark, mismatched posters. The window was draped in a heavy black sheet. A worn-out mattress sat on the floor, surrounded by discarded clothes and energy drink cans. The room smelled of sweat and old vinyl. The splintered cradle was there, but covered in clothes, paper, and magazines. He was standing in a messy, isolated teenage den. For the first time ever, Jonas could see the shape of the entity from the corner of his eye. A large figure stood silhouetted against the dark window, tall, broad-shouldered, radiating coiled frustration and resentment. It turned towards Jonas, and the air turned bitter with accusation. A deep, resonant voice, no longer a child, but heavy with the weight of years that never were, whispered,
"Why didn't you save me?"
Jonas let out a straggled cry, flinging himself out of the room. It knew him. It blamed him. He didn't know what the entity meant. Save them. He scrambled for the light switch, his hand shaking so violently he missed it twice. When the room finally flooded with light, he stood, panting, staring in the empty room. For the mess had vanished, leaving only the wooden cradle standing in the room. The teenage resentment, the blame, the accusation, it was the final straw. He had hidden his grief, buried it, only for it to be manifested in his home, growing and accusing him of the deepest, unacknowledged failure, not being strong enough to keep a life safe, a life he never knew at that. He felt his careful, constructed sanity begin to shred, his reality collapsing into a spiral of paranoia and exhaustion. He sat on the floor outside the hallway of the nursery door, his knees pulled to his chest. He hadn't showered. He hadn't eaten. He told Lydia he had a stomach bug and to keep her distance. Lydia was scared now. Not of the house, but of him. He saw it in the strained concern in her eyes. The way she kept her voice deliberately gentle, as if speaking to a child or an invalid. Jonas thought of his next move. The crib. It was time to do what he should have done the second they saw it. He was going to burn it, destroy it, bury it, anything to get rid of this entity that had taken control of his life. Jonas thrusted himself off of the floor and threw the nursery door open. He marched right over to the cradle and started to grab it, only to notice something was now laying in it. A little bump, the size of an infant covered in blankets. He froze, staring at it, afraid of what was to come next. Jonas shakes back into the reality that he must work quickly to remove the cradle before the entity can do anything to harm him any further. Just when he goes to make a move towards the cradle, though, he heard the quiet, constant whisper. It was no longer the breathy chants or angry accusations. It was a single, low, deeply mournful plea. A voice full of aching loneliness of something completely abandoned. Please don't leave me. It repeated it over and over, slow and painful. Jonas couldn't move. He couldn't hide. He couldn't lie. He couldn't smile. He was done. He had carried the secret weight for too long. The silent, unacknowledged loss that had turned itself into a monster and now was begging him for mercy. He fell to the floor out of fear and desperation. The words came out ragged, tearing from his throat. A confession to the darkness. A surrender to the entity. What do you want from me? The house felt utterly silent. The whispers had stopped. The frantic rocking had ceased. A violent gush of wind plows through the room, pushing Jonas out of the nursery and slamming the door behind him. Jonas pushed himself up. He couldn't let it go anymore. He walked slowly to the door. He placed his hand on the cold metal and turned the knob. He stepped inside once again. The room was a dizzying, terrifying kaleidoscope of time. It was empty, bare walls, dust motes dancing in the shaft of moonlight. It felt depressing. Then, it was a nursery. Blue paint, a faint smell of powder, the delicate ghost image of a hanging mobile. Then, the toddler's room. A red wooden block visible for a blink. The sound of a frustrated thump against the plaster. Then, the child's room. A faded, joyful rubber duck pattern on the curtains, followed by a fleeting, gasping choke. Then, the teenager's den. Dark, silent, reeking of rebellion and loss. A heavy shadow on the wall. The room cycled through all 5 versions in a span of 10 seconds, like a demonic film reel, being rewound and sped up. The only constant was the empty, dark cradle in the center, a permanent anchor to the life that had never began. In the doorway, the shadowy figure coalesced. It wasn't a child or a teenager or a demon. It was an absence, a twisting mass of darkness that shifted and stretched, undefined, shaped only by the depths of Jonas's sorrow. It was his grief, given form. Jonas walked towards the cradle, ignoring the entity standing in the doorway, his fear rushing into his head, not knowing what was to come. What did the darkness want from him? He looked at the shifting shadows, his eyes clear for the first time in months. He repeated his question, his voice calm, no longer a scream, but a statement of devastating truth. What do you want from me? The shadowy figure stabilized, its form still vague, but its intentions focused on him. The voice that emerged was a low hum, multi-layered, combining the cue, the first words, the bitter accusation into one sorrowful plea. To be remembered. To know I mattered. Jonas stopped beside the cradle, placing his hand on the smooth, cold wood. This wasn't a threat. It was a soul begging for acknowledgement. The sorrow met the entity's yearning. He looked at the empty basin, the space where life should have rested, and he opened the gate that he had kept locked inside himself for months. He couldn't explain the emotions felt at the moment. He felt a raw, burning pain he had never faced in his chest. He felt the sting of tears. a suffocating failure, the despair of having to be the rock when he was shattered inside. He leaned down and whispered into the hollow cradle, his voice thick with a final, released truth of his heart. I will never forget you. The moment the words left his lips, the shadowy figure softened, its edges blurred. The darkness dissolved into a rush of surprisingly warm air that smelled of fresh rain and clean linens. The air passed over Jonas. A cleansing sigh. He watched, utterly captivated, as the splintered, dark, ancient cradle stopped rocking. It stood still, silent, finally, at peace. Jonas woke up the next morning in his own bed, feeling an exhaustion so deep it felt holy. Lydia was gone. He looked beside his bedside clock. 8 a.m. He had slept for hours. He walked down the hall, his heart braced for the sight of a dark relic. He opened the nursery door. The room was different. It was no longer a vortex of changing shapes, but a clean, empty, adult room. A simple wooden bed stood against the far wall, a half-packed, worn suitcase sitting open on the plain, crisp quilt. A figure stood by the window, silhouetted by the morning sun, a tall, young man of about 18, facing the light. He looked peaceful, gentle, and utterly real. He turned towards Jonas. His face was unremarkable, a kind stranger, but his eyes were ancient and full of released sorrow. The young man walked towards Jonas, not with the angry strides of a dream, but with the quiet dignity of a departure long awaited. They made eye contact. Jonas wasn't sure how or why, but he knew this young man. There was something in his eye that he couldn't identify, but somehow he knew who he was and his entire life story. He even saw a little bit of himself in the young man's eyes. The young man stopped in front of Jonas and simply hugged him. Jonas, in shock, but also in peace, returned the embrace. He felt no cold, no fear, only an overwhelming, complete sense of peace, finality, and acceptance. He hugged his grief, the silent sorrow he had carried. The young man finally pulled back, his lips curving into a soft, bittersweet smile. Thank you, he whispered, his voice clear and whole. He then picked up his suitcase, turned, and walked towards the door. Jonas watched him go, a sense of profound closure settling over his shoulders. He turned back to the room. The room was completely, finally, empty. The bed was gone, the suitcase was gone, and the splintered, dark, ancient cradle was gone. The house was vibrant, filled with laughter and the smell of freshly baked bread. In the room at the end of the hall, the walls were painted a pale, soothing yellow. A new, modern, light wood cradle stood against the wall. It contained a small, breathing presence, their daughter, Lily. Jonas stood over the cradle, rocking it gently, his face soft with love. He had his own family now. He was finally, truly happy. Lydia came up behind him, kissing his neck. What are you thinking about, quiet man? Jonas smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached his eyes. Just how lucky I am. He was about to turn away when he felt a familiar, soft displacement of air beside him, an icy feather stroke on his ankle, a memory of cold. It was no longer a shadow or a voice, just a sense of quiet presence. He felt a prang in his chest. It wasn't terror. It was a gentle, aching sadness, followed immediately by the oddest sense of missing the entity that had tormented him. He missed the version of life, however terrifying, that had kept his loss alive. He looked down at Lily, sleeping soundly in the new cradle. He looked back at the empty space beside him, and the presence faded. Jonas knew the life that had never been was finally, peacefully, an occasional visitor in the man's mind, but a quiet memory, no longer a raging ghost. He turned and embraced Lydia, holding her and Lily. the daughter he could hold, the love he could share, the healing he had earned. The hollow inside him, so vast and crippling for so long, was finally filled with the warmth of the family he now held close. The entity would always be remembered, but could no longer control him. The entity had a new home, and Jonas's home was right here with Lydia and Lily, and no darkness could ever swallow that light.